What superhero best embodies the American way, the American dream? Now, many people say superheroes are our modern mythology. Mythological heroes often embody the ideals that people should strive for, as well as the tragic realities that define us as people. Hercules was mighty, sure, able to break monsters and hydras against his fists, but he was also capable of causing great harm to those he loved. Odysseus, master strategist, able to end the Trojan War, but his pride brought about ruination to those who followed him, and kept him from his wife for about 20 years. What heroes today are our version of Hercules and Odysseus, embodying the best and worst of the country they come from? America. Now, the first thing to ask is, what embodies America? What is it? After 250 years, we kind of should figure it out, shouldn't we? Well, the answer is, it's changing. It's a flexible definition. Superheroes have been around a while and were created at a time where America meant something very different than it does today. But they haven't changed all that much. Many superheroes come from America, yes, and as such are aligned with the interests of the country when the characters were created. And many were made between 1930s and 1965. More patriotic than our current modern day.
China!
Many of these heroes were made to be propaganda, let's be blunt about it. But many were also written as counters to the mainstream politics of their day. Captain America, for example, was introduced decking Hitler in the jaw, knocking him out cold. Superman fought Nazis. Batman's earliest film was a serial opposing anti-Japanese sentiment, fighting embodiments of Orientalist stereotypes about our warfaring enemies. It was during the height of the Pacific Theater that Batman's serial came out. Wonder Woman also fought Nazis. Comics inspired people at home and on the war front. Soldiers loved reading comics. They could pick a few up, read them, trade them around the camp, and then move on to the next. Disposable, simple entertainment that inspired. Were some extremely racist? Absolutely, especially if the Japanese, but that was what was going on. But you gotta keep in mind that not all of those comics I just described were made with the same intentions behind the characters. For example, that comic I mentioned first, Captain America punching Hitler, that one, the famous decking him across the jaw, well, that was published December 1940. Why does that matter? Well, America didn't enter the war until December 1941. Pearl Harbor. That was what got us in. A year after that comic came out. We're probably thinking, well, we were fighting Nazis before then, right? Well, no, we weren't actually. In fact, Nazis were popular in America in 1940 when Captain America punched Hitler in the jaw. That was counterculture. Hollywood studios, as late as November 1941, were trying not to offend German audiences by depicting Hitler as anything short of a competent leader. There were a few exceptions, of course, like The Great Dictator, released 2 months prior to Captain America's debut, back in October 1940. The Great Dictator was inspired by Charlie Chaplin watching Triumph of the Will, Nazi propaganda, in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And no doubt Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, Captain America's creators, also knew Triumph of the Will was being screened in their own backyard, as well as knowing how, back in February 1939, the Nazis held a rally in Madison Square Garden and were celebrated for it as a peaceful demonstration of their patriotism for a country at the time already invading Poland.
That was really bad.
I bring this up to remind you, superheroes were not merely propaganda. It's easy to look back on history and see it that way. But Captain America was not made to be propaganda. He was made to be counterculture. It just so happens it lent itself well to propaganda when the culture shifted. He challenged Americans to question their hateful rhetoric, to question the rhetoric set around them. But one day, that rhetoric did shift. Also in 1940, Superman picked up Stalin and Hitler and dragged them off to be tried at the League of Nations. At the time, Stalin was seen as just as bad as Hitler. In fact, maybe the greater of two evils. How things changed so quickly compared to the Captain America who was just decking out Hitler. Now, Captain America, Human Torch, and the Submariner, they all fought the Nazis. The various comics, though, especially those published by DC, then National Comics, would sell war bonds and war stamps to kids to fund the war effort. comics were instrumental in funding war. Cap fought Red Skull. Wonder Woman fought Paula von Gunther. Think Red Skull's the more memorable villain though, of course. Bad guys were embodiments of our enemies of war. And this did not really change even after World War II ended. During the Cold War, the same thing happened. Look at Iron Man's villains. You have Russian and Chinese caricatures like Crimson Dynamo, the Mandarin. Some efforts like The Adventures of Superman, though, took the obvious tension, the drive to turn enemies of the state into comic book villains, and redirect it somewhat, focusing rather on foreign threats like Iron Man and more onto domestic threats like the Ku Klux Klan. Superman effectively revealed then relevant codes for the Klan to public audiences across the radio, to as big an audience as possible, helping actually combat the then already dying Klan. While the Klan would rise up again in a third rising, this did help cement the end of the second rising of the Klan. It's hard to be a part of something secret when Superman is telling the world your secrets. Any type of credibility they once had was gone. And they did have credibility in the United States. Again, superheroes seen as propaganda one year and counterculture the next. In the 1940s, the US government saw comics as the greatest avenue for propaganda and war profiteering. In the 1950s, with the publication of Seduction of the Innocent, they saw comics as an avenue to leading children to bad behavior, such as homosexuality and socialism. I know, the truest evils of them all. Once the US government no longer had an explicit use for comics, they turned on them. Is it any wonder that 1960s comics felt more cynical about the military complex in general? One of the most iconic villains created in the 60s was Marvel's General Thunderbolt Ross, a corrupt general who hunted the Hulk down, an embodiment of the military complex attacking those they helped give power to. Nuclear weapons, especially radioactive weapons of all kinds, were seen as avenues to either destroy or make heroes. A confusing time for comics, I suppose. But make no mistake, despite characters like General Ross, many heroes were also war veterans, soldiers. Many superheroes have origins anchored in the military, with the military being framed in a somewhat positive fashion. Hal Jordan was a military test pilot. Harold Danvers was in the Air Force. War Machine, Moon Knight, The Punisher, they're all Marines. So was Jon Stewart, for that matter. Flash Thompson, Peter Parker's bully turned friend turned Venom, is a military veteran who lost his legs in the war. In Zack Snyder's Justice League, we learn Martian Manhunter has disguised himself as a military general since possibly Man of Steel. And of course, there's Nick Fury, there's S.H.I.E.L.D., there's any government operative that is seen as a positive. Oh yeah, I almost forgot, there's also Sergeant Stone. As well as G.I. Robot, for that matter. There are a number of superhero-adjacent stories that are basically just military stories, with some superpowers added in. Sergeant Stone is one of them. One of the more iconic and more prolific ones that's kind of fallen off in terms of popularity over the years, because the stories are basically just military narrative, military fiction. But even then, most of these depictions don't exactly frame the military as purely positive. Some do, but it's not across the board. Frank Castle, for example, his experience in the Marines helped give him the skills to be a killer, sure. He's built up as a tool of war. But any story focusing on Frank's past is often very cynical about the politics of the military. We see that, more often than not, Frank's generals sent him off to basically get killed in dangerous missions. It's only due to his immense skill he survived. Frank becomes better as a killer because he is thrown into life or death situations. The attempts to destroy Frank fail, and a monster emerges on the other side. But I think things got more complicated during the 2000s, which happens to be the height of when superhero films became popular. It was the War on Terror, 9/11 happened. And we couldn't depict the military as anything short of bad when we were fighting an active war. This meant many films and blockbusters became military propaganda. Many film productions made deals with the US military to make sympathetic portrayals of the military in exchange for funding. It offset costs to have the military help you out if you just promoted the military. The MCU and DCEU offered military propaganda throughout their films to varying extents. But it's not always super sympathetic, but somewhat. The first Iron Man movie, for example, is a great example of this. Tony Stark is a military arms dealer who deals the US military and learns his weapons that he makes are being used to kill the very soldiers he fought to protect. His best friend, James Rhodes, is a military guy, a Marine, and he's often involved in military skirmishes, acting as a private military opposing America's enemies. Even after making his Iron Man suit, it's essentially a military weapon. Is this film cynical about those who profit from war, or sympathetic to the soldiers? It's debatable. There were many scenes that were cut that showed military marches and soldiers walking around in ways that glorified war. And in fact, elements of Ironmonger's motivation were to be kind of this architect of war in a positive, or at least semi-sympathetic extremist way. But it was all cut, resulting in a movie focused on a guy who profits from the deaths of soldiers. At no point are soldiers not reflected as sympathetic. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is worth considering how media influences your perspective of violence. That being said, though, the first Iron Man was least sympathetic to those who were suffering in the Middle East, under jurisdiction from organizations that were more paramilitary, more designed to conquer and torture. At least it was more sympathetic than the average depiction of the Middle Easterns that audiences had become accustomed to at that time. It sounds like the bare minimum today, but at the time, that was something more significant. After decades of wartime propaganda demonizing Middle Easterners, is that counterculture, or is that reinforcing a shifting culture? Your mileage will vary. At least it's not as bad as we saw in Transformers. Meanwhile, in Man of Steel, the introduction of the DC Extended Universe, we see the military first as a force who wants to compromise with General Zod. They'll capture Superman to keep Zod happy and not invading the Earth. But we soon see that Superman just ends up working with the military out of convenience to stop Zod, and they help him out unquestioningly. But we also see later on that Superman doesn't want to have the military invade his privacy. It's bad when the military invades his privacy, but it's good that the military is defending Earth. And often, the American military, and just the American military, is seen as the sole defending force against all threats the DC Universe faces. Oh, and again, the General is Martian Manhunter, an alien. So there's that, I guess. I think the biggest example of American propaganda in superhero films is one of the more mainstream characters. In every Spider-Man movie, he swings against an American flag. Homecoming has a sequence in Washington, D.C., where he has to save people in the Washington Monument, his own classmates. It's pretty explicit that Spider-Man was made in a post-9/11 world. In fact, there was a scene very famously of the Twin Towers that was cut from the movie. It was in all the advertisements, but when it came time for the film to come out, it was all exercised. And there is a gap in the film where you never actually get introduced to Spider-Man. That could have been the scene that was cut. The trailer, if you slot it into Spider-Man 1, does feel like a natural introduction to Spider-Man at a certain point in the film. But again, it was cut. And we have scenes of New Yorkers uniting in support of each other. That scene in the bridge when New Yorkers start throwing rotten fruit at Green Goblin, for example, after he drops Mary Jane Watson and those kids off the bridge, that feels like post-9/11 optimism at work. It's also an example of pro-American unification. Without demonizing a certain type of person, it shows Americans coming together to support one another, which is a far cry from the comics. In the comics, Spider-Man wouldn't be hanging out with cops and celebrating them. He'd be chased by the cops, maybe accused of murder by someone. Spider-Man was always someone who never fit into society and was always seen as a threat to the mainstream society. J. Jonah Jameson demonizes Spider-Man in the papers, and everyone hates him as a result, outside of maybe Captain Stacy. In the films, however, Captain Stacy, when he does show up, is the only cop investigating Spider-Man who's a serious contender and shifts over time. Once Captain Stacy's gone, the cops and firefighters and all that, they're applauding Spider-Man, cheering him on. No big issue there. But of all the portrayals of the military that's interesting, I think that the MCU's Punisher is the most explicitly cynical regarding the military. Ray Schoonover, Frank Castle's former commanding officer, who I will refer to now on as Mr. Krabs, for reasons that should be obvious if you've ever seen the SpongeBob SquarePants casting, funded his illegal operations in the military by becoming a drug dealer. That being, Mr. Krabs' operations was funded by drug deals. Despite Mr. Krabs training Frank to be a killer, he ultimately puts a hit on Frank's family. He's accountable for Frank's life being ruined, and thus Frank becoming the Punisher. He both trained him to become a weapon, and then gave him the proper motivation to keep killing. Though incidentally, of course, he didn't want to do that. And then, of course, there's Amanda Waller, across all of DC. But also, there's S.H.I.E.L.D., who allows Hydra to infiltrate them. As we'll see, a lot of these stories present the military as incompetent, more often actively malicious, because of how often it gets infiltrated. I mean, look, DC has the fucking Martian Manhunter infiltrate the military too, so I guess everything's compromised now. When it comes to historical depictions, though, it's more optimistic than the present day. Wonder Woman joins the military effort in World War I, and we learn that Ares is responsible for all the bad things happening. He's the one whispering in the ear of everyone and spurring on war. In Captain America the First Avenger, while the American and British militaries are seen positively, Steve Rogers tries joining the army to fight the Nazis because he wants to stop bullies. He only becomes part of a military experiment to become super soldier to stop the worst bullies of all. But the film makes a distinction between what Steve Rogers is and what the military wants Captain America to be. Steve is not a perfect soldier, he's a good man. A perfect soldier would become a monster like Red Skull. If powers of the super soldier's serum influence someone, it makes whatever's inside more extreme. A perfect soldier would become an extreme killer. It needs a good man at the end of the serum. This background also offers some contrast to the world Captain America finds himself in the sequel. In The Winter Soldier, we see that the world's not so simple. Back in World War II, Steve fought the Nazis. He fought Hydra. They're objectively bad. But in Winter Soldier, he's fighting what? Not much. He's keeping the secrets of the military safe. He's protecting Nick Fury's secrets, S.H.I.E.L.D. secrets. Before, he fought bad guys. Now he protects the bad guys. And the bad guys are America. And that does not sit well with Steve. I think honestly the most cynical example, though, of pro-military propaganda in the MCU comes from a film that everyone insists is very woke, Captain Marvel. The film pays lip service to the idea that women are kept out of the Air Force, that it's sexism keeping them out, but there's no sign of that. Carol Danvers becomes a test pilot, she has another friend who's in the military, and it's framed as purely positive. It's good that we're breaking boundaries to allow them to be cool Air Force pilots. Her memories of the US military are what ultimately help her to detach from her Kree programming. The film ends with her essentially relocating the Skrulls to a peaceful world. It's not exactly deportation, but it doesn't exactly change that option. It does show that healthy borders between cultures is a good thing, which is interesting in hindsight. It also depicts S.H.I.E.L.D. as a purely good organization, despite the fact that at this time, we know for a fact Hydra has infiltrated said organization. And as we later learn, there's the Skrulls, who also invaded S.H.I.E.L.D. It's like everything's being infiltrated. The US military, the Kree are there, because we have Mar-Vell in there, and it's all tied up with the Kree interests. And the movie never reckons with the fact that multiple military branches of the US government are infiltrated by aliens, like actual aliens and the Nazis, at once. But then there's the most frustrating character of them all, and that's Sam Wilson. Sam Wilson is a hard character to figure out in this story, because every time we think we get him, he does something that goes against the version of Sam we're introduced to. Sam starts as a veteran with trauma, who essentially helps uplift other veterans who are not getting the help they need. Steve Rogers and him see eye to eye on a lot of fronts, being soldiers out of their war. And he helps Steve dismantle S.H.I.E.L.D., an organization that is corrupt beyond measure, and he destroys it the moment it's compromised. When Sam is handed the shield of Captain America, two things happen. For one, well actually first he denies taking the shield, it takes a little while, but after that, the first thing is he's confronted by America's personal choice to replace Captain America, that being John Walker. And he encounters the Flag Smashers, an anti-establishment terrorist organization who wants to basically help displaced people, and they bring revolution to benefit a large amount of people without other options. He learns the US government experimented on soldiers to create new Captain Americas, but especially poor, underprivileged black people, like Isaiah Bradley, a man who was incarcerated for decades to hide the US government's corrupt actions. And it's never reckoned with. Many of these stories are taken right from the comics, by the way. These are comic stories. But Sam's ultimate choice is to play mediator on the most banal level for the status quo. The bad guys go too far with their plans, but the government needs to do better, or some bullshit like that. By the way, the only characters who die in the finale are the Flag Smashers, the anti-establishment terrorists. and no one else. Not the people causing the conflict at all, or refusing to compromise, but the guys trying to fight for freedom. Now sure, John Walker does murder someone in public, but the show doesn't hesitate to show how he is ultimately a product of military training. He is what the US government wants out of Captain America. He is that perfect soldier given incredible power, and he is later hired as a secret agent for the CIA, who then also tried to kill him to protect the CIA's secrets. All great, I suppose. Fantastic. Love that messaging. Again, the US government is shown as corrupt, but Sam still defends the US government. Later on, Sam Wilson has to defend Thunderbolt Ross from the leader. And Thunderbolt Ross, by the way, is now President of the United States. And Indiana Jones. The leader's whole motivation is to ruin Ross's life because Ross is an asshole. That's it. That's the main motivation of the villain in Brave New World. While both characters are clearly villains, the leader is framed as inhuman, while Ross, who again is the president, and later a Hulk, and Indiana Jones, is framed as sympathetic, almost tragic. And this is after multiple films where Ross was shown to be a complete monster, who used people as pawns to further his personal agenda. And most often, that agenda was war, destruction, horror, death. Now, some people online, like Pop Culture Detective in his video, Marvel Defenders of the Status Quo, argue that superheroes are inherent embodiments of the status quo, creating tools only to destroy and forcing people not to change. He cites Iron Man as someone who only uses technology as a hero to build greater weapons to fight. And I feel this ignores elements of the characters. Like I know in Phase 1, for example, Tony Stark creates renewable green energy that completely changes the scientific capabilities of the Marvel Universe. But then again, is that for personal profit? Who really knows? But the point is, the idea that these heroes only defend the status quo is reductive, I think. Many stories do focus, of course, on maintaining a status quo, and it's often emphasized by how tampering with things outside their understanding can have some bad consequences. Doctor Strange is shown to do this constantly in Multiverse of Madness, where we see multiple other versions of Doctor Strange who tampered, causing problems. I'm reminded of Cobb from Earthsea, a villain who ends death but causes nature to collapse due to the unforeseen consequences of his actions. When watching, say, Scarlet Witch use the Darkhold to find a universe she can be with her children again. There is a desire that is good, but the effects can be negative. When it comes to political status quo, that's a little different. It's one thing to say the laws of reality shouldn't be changed for any reason, but politics, it's a little different, isn't it? Tony Stark primarily fights three kinds of enemies in his films. Foreigners, like the Ten Rings or Thanos, villains born as a consequence of his own actions, like, say, Ultron or Spider-Man's various bad guys, or corporations, like Obadiah Stane and Justin Hammer. But in Iron Man 3, it's all three at once. We essentially see how the corporate machine exploits veterans for profit, and how the one doing all the exploitation is someone who Tony slighted. And the United States government is again compromised by another evil organization, that being AIM. How many MCU stories have a corrupt president or vice president or general or a military complex or commander of some kind? There's a lot, apparently. Many of these stories frame the US's problems on bad apples instead of the institutional issues that need to be addressed. But some movies like Captain America and even Black Panther to a lesser extent do push to illustrate systemic changes that can, over time, make positive growth. And other times, the US government is corrupt, like in Wakanda Forever, where they still try to steal vibranium from Wakanda. But things have to change over time, or rapidly. Who knows? But despite clearing America of its bad influences, seldom has the country ever improved on a material level, in the comics, or in the films, or in games, whatever. And it's most because stories default to that status quo, because that's simply familiar territory for many readers and writers. It's something you get to know about. It doesn't have to make things confusing or difficult to follow. It's the status quo. But while most heroes maintain that status quo, which heroes best embody America and don't oppose the status quo of America all that much in the modern day? Now, at this point, it's better to question, what is American? Is it freedom? Is it helping people pursue happiness? What does it mean to be an American, to defend the American dream? And there's several different superheroes who embody aspects of the American dream, but often they're figures of counterculture. Now, Tony Stark is in many ways not a counterculture figure. He was created to be an embodiment of certain traits of Americanism, capitalism specifically. America is ultimately a country built on industry, and Tony Stark is industry personified. More so than Batman, another rich billionaire hero. Tony embodies the spirit of capitalism, of innovation in the best possible way. I'd argue an impossible way. At the same time, he is a character defined by a lack of control. He innovates because he needs to put a suit of armor around the world to control everything, make sure everything's right. That's true in the comics and it's true in the films. But in this Captain America and Superman, they're clear embodiments of the American spirit as a concept because they emphasize freedom, not control, but inspiration, growth. And I think as America becomes more dominated by cynical corruption, their behavior becomes increasingly counter-cultural. Both believe in the rights of truth and justice, that American way we all dream about, but that American way runs counter to the American reality. Clark Kent is as much an immigrant as anyone else, a refugee from an alien planet. He lives in Kansas, he's adopted, and Captain America is a spirit of American potential. He fights for those to allow themselves to be free, and when the country doesn't follow what he believes it should do, he rejects that country. Both Superman and Captain America aren't afraid to force the country to change by action, by demonstration. Superman fights for the President of the United States, the government, and all the forces of the world because they trample on the rights of the innocent. Captain America revokes the Stars and Stripes as his symbol, becoming nomad, a man without a country who keeps fighting a good fight for the innocent guy. Sometimes, to defend truth and freedom, you need to not embody America. They fight outside the nation. That is why they are not an example of the American reality. They are purely the dream, the optimism, the hope, because the reality is a defilement of that hope. Another example of good, the X-Men. They're marginalized people, all of whom pursue their own liberty and happiness, opposing bigotry. They're from all across the world, embodying the idea of America as a melting pot. After all, the Chris Claremont X-Men, they're deliberately international. More so than the first class. I mean, Cyclops, Jean Grey, they're American, they're white, whatever. But the Claremont X-Men, you got Storm, who's from Africa. Nightcrawler, a blue guy from Germany. You got Colossus, a communist, a Soviet Union Russian. You got Wolverine, a Canadian. Yeah, really going outside the grain of America, aren't you? And it reflects diversity as a strength, that if you come together from all walks of life, you can accomplish something great. But also the obstacles that oppose diverse people. A free country this is, but it's dominated by bigotries. But I hate to say this, none of them reflect what we are. They represent the opportunity that we have in a book, on a document, but they are not a picture of America. If Steve Rogers is the American dream, John Walker is the product of that dream. A soldier rebuilt to be a perfect weapon for the government, who fights for his nation purely, but really for glory. He's been broken down and assembled as something commercial and superficial, superfluous maybe, something violent and traditional and territorial. Something rejected by those with taste, but not by those who want power. He is a controlled commodity, a replacement of true heroism that can be marketed, a product of capitalism. How is John Walker different than Chris Kyle, a man who inspired the film American Sniper? They're both deeply unwell soldiers who followed orders and returned home with deep-seated trauma and a collection of war crimes behind them. The American military complex, conservative lionization, that is what they brought, that's what they embody. Someone who committed what are ostensibly war crimes in the name of flag and country. A man who, even when dead, was propped up like a puppet to be a symbol of America. All while hiding his numerous bigotries and crimes in his own words, forgotten and overlooked to offer the truth of his palatable heroism. Hell, John Walker is ultimately a complete fabrication, even when looking at John Walker the man. Much like how it's widely believed that most of Kyle's memoirs and accounts are entirely fabricated too. Walker isn't Captain America, he's just a prop for the military complex. If the X-Men represent diversity, then the Sentinels and William Stryker represent the reaction to that diversity. Industrial and religious fanaticism that demands we conform to a singular ideal. They embody violent forcefulness to adhere to the tenets of the proper community. Throughout history, whenever movements have come to grant the marginalized a little bit more freedom, a little bit more life, a little bit more happiness, there is a resistance to it. In X-Men 97, we witness people lording through chat rooms and conversation to be rebuilt into living sentinels, sleeper agents who don't know when they will strike next. Though they aren't willing sentinels, they're only able to be converted because at some point, some part of them allowed themselves to be radicalized by media, opposing the unification of diverse people to oppose it, out of fear of being replaced. Even that woman who flirts with Beast, she was at some point turned into a sentinel, implying that at some point she was drawn down that same path of radicalization. Perhaps we intrinsically are fascinated, even aroused, even fetishizing that which we hate in terms of minorities. A fact I think is validated when you compare two maps. One of the most transphobic states in the country and the most popular search terms on Pornhub. Here's a hint, they overlap quite a bit with what they hate. And if Superman is the greatest we can be, an immigrant who fights for truth and freedom for the little guy, a Kansas small person at a farm, then what character is the counterbalance? Not a farm boy who grew up to be humble, chose to be close to people he loved and cared about, but a rich man who believes himself superior because he stomped on everyone else to get up to the top. A man who fears those different from him will make him obsolete. The embodiment of great replacement. Fears, though, extended to a cosmic scale. The most American superhero character is not Clark Kent, it's not Steve Rogers, it's not Tony Stark, and it's certainly not Aurora Monroe. It's Lex Luthor. Luthor is a capitalist. He's ambitious. Eventually, he becomes the President of the United States and stands firm against Imperiex in the embodiment of universal entropy. And it is indeed Lex Luthor working with Superman that stops Imperiex. The two combined, their efforts can stop even the destructive forces that destroy us, but Lex chooses not to work with Superman. When he does, the world can change, but he doesn't want to out of arrogance and bigotries. His arrogance does not let him pursue true greatness, and instead he decides to fight those he fears may replace him, or make him not the center of the world. Like America, he can accomplish good by working with immigrants and foreigners and migrants, but chooses not to. He fears becoming obsolete when confronted with the natural talents of someone else from outside. He can't handle not being the most important person around, and like so many Americans, fears replacement, a great replacement. As such, he hates the Superman, hates anything that feels foreign to him in this world. He will work with the worst people imaginable, even the Joker, to further his sociopathic ends, all while convincing himself he is the hero, he is the great man. In actuality, he's a ruthless monster who uses his wealth that he could use for the betterment of society for his obsessive hatred of someone specific. He wants to purge that which is unlike him. Superman was the creation of two Jewish boys, crafting a hero constructed from their favorite childhood films and characters. He was their American dream made manifest. And Lex is the presence that squashes that dream because it threatens his power. Lex believes himself to be the Superman. And there is nothing more American, I feel, than that. Every villain in comics, from Kingpin to Penguin, keeps running for office, sometimes winning. If you want an image of what America is today, look at the character who was once the President of the United States, and honestly, if we're all being honest with ourselves, feels like a better candidate than the one we currently have. Hell, Danny DeVito's Penguin might be a better candidate. I mean, he was literally backed by Tim Burton's parody of Donald Trump.
China